Now we've shifted over to a new type of question. This is what's called a transition question. Basically what we need to do is fill in this blank with a word that's going to connect two ideas very seamlessly. That's going to make sure we can think about the type of transition we need. This is not a grammar question. So it's not like one of these words is correct because of the comma or anything like that. So you don't have to think about grammar anymore. That part of the test is over. This is about which word fits. Now, some of these words might be a little bit unfamiliar to you, especially if English is not your first language. You're probably not using nevertheless very often. But luckily, these are words that kind of have similar, simple meanings, okay? So similarly is another way of saying also or and. For instance, is kind of like for example. Nevertheless is a fancy version of the word but, and as a result is a fancy version of the word so. These actually represent the four transition word categories that come up very often on the SAT. They're not the only types of transitions, but they're the four main ones. I have a whole video lesson about this. Basically, what we need to make sure we do is get back to these simpler definitions. So we know what the word and means. We know that but is a contrast word. We know that so is a cause and effect word. So if we can think in these simpler terms, then we're less intimidated by the fact that nevertheless is just like a long kind of annoying word. We're just thinking which of these simpler words would we put in this blank to better think about what's going on. So let's read it. Let's see if we can come up with any sort of intuitive grasp of it. In Gothic architecture, flying buttresses are large arches that help support a building's exterior walls. Before the Gothic era, cathedrals' heavy ceilings had to be supported by thick, short walls, but the invention of flying buttresses eliminated this need. Gothic cathedrals could be built with thinner, higher walls. So, okay, I don't see any reason for a but here, right? We actually have a but, right? So before the Gothic era, cathedrals' heavy ceilings had to be supported by thick, short walls, but the invention of flying buttresses eliminated this need. So here it used to be thick, but now thin. Right? So we can see there's a contrast. It's not necessarily a positive versus negative contrast, or at least not obviously so, but it is still some sort of opposite. But then what's this next sentence saying? Gothic cathedrals could be built with thinner, higher walls. Notice, that's also talking about thin walls. So it's reinforcing what we just said. So we don't want a word like nevertheless. We also don't want a word like for instance, because basically what's happening with that is that last sentence there would be an example of the previous sentence. But it's not an example of it, right? It's not naming a particular Gothic cathedral that has these thinner walls. It's not that. It's reinforcing the idea, but it's not doing it by providing a specific instance or example of that idea. It's also not making a contrast or a comparison. It's not saying that one situation is similar to another. It's literally the same situation. They're just kind of explaining it further. So as a result is the best way to do this. We need a so here because think about it. If we put a so in there, what's really happening is the invention of flying buttresses eliminated this need for thick walls. So Gothic cathedrals could be built with thinner, higher walls because now the thick walls weren't needed, right? The because that I just threw in there is more evidence that this is a so situation, a cause and effect situation. We're explaining kind of a thought process about the thickness of the walls and the flying buttresses. If that part is kind of a little confusing at the end, that's just a reminder that one of the ways to handle these transition questions is not to necessarily always positively get the answer. It's not, we can do process of elimination on these. We can kind of look through the words that we know and know which ones don't work and cross them out confidently. And sometimes genuinely with these transition questions, the right answer is just whatever's left over. It might not feel instinctively right. We might not have that kind of gut reaction that that word definitely fits in that blank. That's okay. Doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Sometimes it's just there isn't a transition that stands out, but there are a bunch that we can say, no, this definitely does not work. And then through process of elimination, we're left with the right answer. So I do that. You can do that too. As long as you know what these transition words mean by knowing the four categories, you should be fine to sort through them correctly.